The culture that you have is made up of everything that has ever formed you.
The current of Italian culture today, rooted to family, celebration, and the ethnic faces of Canada's children, are strongly rooted to the immigrant story. A story composed of those who traveled from their homeland in quest for a new beginning. It is with the immigrant story and contemporary culture that the relationship between the past, present, and future becomes significant. What composes the mold of a cultural circle? What does it mean to be Italian today?
What do you want to do? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5? I came to Canada at the age of 11.
I was born in an Italian family, but I grew up in a small rural town in Ontario. That was an important factor.
I was 13 years of age when I immigrated to Canada with my mom and my brother.
I was 2 years old when I came with my brother, my sister, and my mom, and we came by boat.
I was born in Niagara. My mom and dad both came from Friuli, from Fagagna and Friuli.
My history is rooted in their journeys. Their histories are rooted in coming from Italy, in their stories.
I never lived in an Italian community. I always lived with Germans, Yugoslavians, Hungarian, all the different nationalities.
If you talk about a pioneer, a family that's a pioneer, my mom and dad leaving a country and a language and a culture that they knew.
These people came to this country with nothing in their pocket, just the passion in their heart to do something new, because back home was poverty, and built a family, built a country.
Well, I remember going to kindergarten and not being able to speak English at all.
When I first arrived, we obviously associated with the Italian community. There were Italian stores, the Italian church, the Italian radio programs.
In those days, in the 1950s and 60s, keep in mind what the world was like politically. It was not tolerant towards blacks. It was not tolerant towards any kind of immigrants, so it was difficult.
We had more to fight because the English and the Scotch and the Irish and all those, they used to call us Dagos, and they never called me Dago, mind you, but I had to protect my sister. They were afraid of me. I don't know, there was something about me that I was just dominating, and I was Italian.
Italian guy said, Donnelly said, you're going to go out into the real world and you're going to have to realize that, with a name like Zeraldo, there may be some prejudices. I'd never encountered it, never seen it, so it's very foreign to me. So I don't feel it. I don't feel it against other people from anywhere in the world. And so I've been blessed with the opportunity that I grew up in a very nurturing environment.
Most of us, I think, we tried to not even integrate but assimilate with the Canadian society. In fact, Giovanni became John, Antonio became Anthony. We tried to fit in the Canadian society as quickly as we possibly could. These days, I think, and rightly so, we tend to have a dual identity. We are very proudly Italo-Canadians rather than simply being Canadian or simply being Italian.
A large component of it is the social aspect of being Italian, the values of being Italian, hard work, dedication to family, commitment to children, and the ability to do well and wanting to do well.
I realized that the assimilation process, while it was positive, it created me as an individual, I realized that there were some other advantages that I had that the other individuals didn't have.
In our desire to integrate and to assimilate, we have perhaps betrayed our traditions.
There are pressures to integrate and sometimes forget your roots.
I think you do need to have an understanding of where you come from. You can't really understand yourself without some understanding of your roots.
Well, I was proud of my Italian culture. I never hid that I was Italian. I loved being Italian, and we were respected.
It was very difficult for me to understand my parents, for instance, when I was young, until I went to Italy. The first time I went there was when I was 12. Up until then, being Italian was a very vague concept for me. I really only associated it with being an immigrant and with being marginal and with being different. I had mainly negative associations. I assumed that we were poorer than other people, that we did things in a way that was somehow not proper, that was sort of reflective of the poverty of our immigrant roots.
I'm very proud of being an Italian. At one time when I was growing up and I was young, I used to look at that as a disadvantage. And in fact, you even got to the point of being ashamed of being an Italian or having another language or another culture, because you're always in an environment where people around you always spoke English.
I can say that, quite frankly, I put a lot of emphasis on maintaining my roots, maintaining those aspects that people would consider me to be very Italian.
In my case, I think Italians being Italian is really cool. I mean, the Ferraris, the Versaces, and all the great artists, the Michelangelos, the Da Vincis. I get a lot of pride out of it, and I'm a little arrogant probably about it, if anything. So being Canadian and Italian gives me a phenomenal balance.
The food, the smells from the kitchen, the statues of the religious figures, the images of family on the mantelpieces. I mean, you walk into my grandmother's house, and I swear it looks like a museum of the history of our family, with pictures just almost cluttered, but just placed there because there's a pride, there's a proudness of family and of that Italian background. I think if you got to define what it means to be Italian, you really have to enter an Italian's home, specifically on a holiday or a special occasion, and you'll see the people that gather.
I would never understand how families can't be close-knit, because that's just part of our Italian culture, is to be that way. But also for support. Like, I don't need support groups. I don't need people to go and do therapy with, because we've always had such a close relationship in our family that we can talk to people. And also in the community, because I always found that within the sort of Canadian-Italian or Italian community and that culture, there are always people that you can talk to that will give you good, sensible advice, and when you're younger, discipline, which I think becomes very useful.
From the instant you leave your home country, from the instant you leave Italy, you start to change, you evolve, you become something new.
We developed what linguists call Italiese, a mixture of Italian and English.
Because Canada is such a melting pot, it was difficult to really get a grasp on what it meant to be Canadian, but we clearly always knew what it meant to be Italian.
It was certainly the case for Italians going back to their first days in this country, that they tended to get stereotyped either as the sort of the sunny peasant or the sort of dangerous mobster. Those were the two images that were available to you as an Italian, and those images were promoted in various ways, probably through advertising at that time as well, through film, through music, through the popular imagination.
We tend to stereotype Italians, French, German, and so forth. And I think we have to be careful. I always have second thoughts when I see, for example, parades here in Canada with a folkloric element in it. Italian people dressed in costumes which no longer exist in Italy. But we are perhaps trying to maintain a tradition, something that was there, 50 or 75 years ago. It is not surprising in some Italian communities, for example, to have a feast and celebration as they would have had in their hometowns. And in fact, in those towns, those feasts and celebrations are no longer celebrated because there has been a certain evolution.
I'm sure if you look at the States, which is sort of a generation ahead of us in terms of Italian immigration, since most of the Italians who immigrated there immigrated before the First World War, and certainly before the Second World War. A lot of Italians there retain a kind of spiritual attachment to Italy, but they don't have the customs, they don't have the language. They have more just the kind of surface symbols of Italianness, going to the coffee bar, hanging out in Little Italy, and so on.
culture must be defined both with a capital C and with a small c. With a capital C would mean we're referring to culture as civilization. With a small c, we're referring to culture as to things of everyday life. For example, to give you an example, when we're saying buongiorno, come stai, and there is the Italian come stai is accompanied with a handshake, perhaps with a hug, with a kiss on the cheek and so forth.
Tradition is more that sense of retention and of often of nostalgia for the past, whereas culture, as I say, is something that changes, that evolves, that grows, that is rooted in tradition certainly, but that ought to be a living thing.
The reason I'm called Donald Ziraldo is that Donald isn't an Italian name, but my dad wanted me to be Canadian. He wanted me to be part of this country.
A few years ago, my dad went to Italy on a vacation and passed away. He had a massive heart attack in Italy when my mom was there. And we have great friends, politicians who when I flew in to see my mom and dad, my dad on his deathbed, etc. They asked me, he says, well, Angelo, don't worry, we'll facilitate you burying your dad in Italy. And I said, no. My dad is coming back with me to Canada. He's going to be buried in Canada because he's a Canadian, we're Canadians, and while we love Italy, that's where my grandchildren and my children are going to be able to visit their nonno.
I've certainly found in my own life, for instance, that having that connection to Italian culture has deeply influenced me as a person, as a writer, and how I look at the world.
It's like having a huge pot of spaghetti sour pasta sauce and only adding a few ingredients to it. The more spices, the more flavors you add make the sauce richer. And I think that's how I see myself as an Italian Canadian here.
To be Canadian means to be also a very good Italian. That's the strength of multiculturalism.
The amazing thing about Canada and the Italian immigrant that came together is the fact that you had opportunity that came from coming to Canada. You had the desire from the immigrant to accomplish things. You had the ability from the immigrant to accomplish things, and the end result was success.
Anybody can achieve what they want in this country as long as you're prepared to put in the time and work hard.
Where I can speak Italian, I can enjoy the food, I can have the values and traditions of the country where I was born and where my parents taught me, and still be a very proud Canadian. So for me, culture is important. It has obviously been changed somewhat as a result of growing up in this country.
I've assimilated to everything Canada has to offer, to the culture that existed here. But what makes me an Italian Canadian is that my culture has enriched this country as well as others.
Am I Italian? Am I Canadian? Well, culturally, I'm both.